Welcome to our Roundup for week 3. Can you believe we're already halfway through the course? Now, we mentioned this last week, but it bears mentioning again. We really appreciate all the active participation in the discussion board. It has been really dynamic. I mean, the quantity of the comments has been great, but more really the quality of the insights and experiences that have been shared have really impressed us. We've been really blown away, and there have been definitely a few times where mutually we thought, wow, it'd be really cool if we could build on those discussions in a live classroom.
And we're also really grateful for those of you who may have joined the course a little late, but are not any less enthusiastic in sharing your thoughts, experiences, and opinions with us. This course is really meant to be a continuous discussion, so wherever you are right now, please take your time and we'll try to respond to some of the newer comments in earlier modules from time to time. And that being said, we also really highly recommend that you read and comment on other people's posts and take advantage of the full learning community. And as I said in some of the feedback, the course is really only as good as the learners who are taking it. So we really do appreciate you and thank you and ask you to keep contributing your unique experiences and help further enrich the course.
So we covered a number of really entertaining but also important cases in Module 3, which we hope compels you to think through the implications of new technologies and how they intersect with crime and security. From the comments in the discussion forum, it seems many of you have been thinking about really similar questions too. So we want to spend some time addressing some of the great questions and contributions that were made.
But before we jump into that, just a quick update on enrollment. So we're over 5,000 students now, which is already way more than we ever imagined. And from the feedback we've received from many of you, it seems the course has been informative and interesting. So if so, please consider sharing it with your friends, colleagues, family, within your organizations, because we really genuinely believe these questions that we're considering in the course are crucial to crafting a better future. Now with that out of the way, on to the comments.
So Richard Stample had another great comment this week, which is becoming a pattern, very consistent. He had a great comment about, hey, the difference between something that is retroactive in the law, perhaps, versus reactive. And so maybe, Dave, you could take a crack at that and just share your thoughts.
Yeah, so first, I was actually really impressed. I made a mistake when I was speaking that part. It was during one of the conversations we were having and kind of riffing back and forth. And I said that the law is retroactive and then kind of immediately caught myself and then said, reactionary. But those are two actually distinctive and important aspects of the law. So retroactive, if you're not familiar, means that using it in the legal context means that if you create a law, then it begins and is put into force at an earlier time. So let's say as of today, there's a new law that says taxis are no longer legal. And if it was retroactive, you could say, and the date takes effect from January 1, 2019. And so therefore, anyone who actually was operating a taxi service from January 1st, 2019 would have in some way violated the law. There is this legal concept, and it does happen, but typically a retroactive law in this fashion would be something that's more positive. So amnesty, for example, if you enter a country illegally, and if you've been here for a certain amount of time, then they could say, as of this date, people that have entered if anyone has entered the date after this time, then they're retroactively kind of forgiven, right? So what I meant to say though, and what the conversation was really about was how the law is reactionary, it's reactive, meaning that the law tends to, we tend to create laws in order to solve existing problems after they occur. And this is good because we don't, if you think of a Minority Report standpoint, you don't want to make people punish them for crimes they haven't committed, and you don't want the law to kind of predict what is going to be happening. That's not what the law is for. But what that also means is if we're always reactionary, if we're always reacting to things that have happened in the past, then from an ethics standpoint, it means that often you can have criminals or bad actors or people, just normal people doing, what is technically legal, but maybe a little bit unethical. And then the law is never going to be able to stay ahead of that, right? So appreciate that for kind of pointing that out. It was something every time I listened to that segment, I would always cringe a little bit because I knew I made a small mistake. But it is an important concept of the law, and it gets into kind of cultural lag and why the non-material aspect of the culture, like the law, is very slow to change. Whereas the material aspects of culture, like technology, changes very quickly, and there are often gaps in between the two. Okay, so the second comment that we wanted to point out is from Jorg HK. Again, a frequent commenter. We really appreciate all of your additions to the course. So one of the things, he's 2 comments in one basically.
Yeah.
And he said that, he said, please don't move fast and break things. And for those that are not familiar with where he's coming from, this is actually kind of a modification of a statement that was made popular by Mark Zuckerberg, who said that, in Silicon Valley.
The founder of Facebook.
Exactly, founder of Facebook, he said, we move fast and break things. That was kind of the mentality of Facebook and has been adopted by many startup founders in the Silicon Valley region. And so Jorg HK was saying, again, bringing cultural lag into this, he was saying, please just take a minute, slow down, break things, disrupt things, sure, but let's take some time and make sure that as we're doing so, we're doing it in a way that's kind of thoughtful and in that regard. He also talked about, though, how there are some ways from a regulatory standpoint that governments and institutions can advance technology forward while maybe minimizing the risk of the breakage, right?
Yeah.
The disruption. And he mentioned something called a sandbox. And so I wanted maybe to ask you to kind of describe what is a sandbox, especially from a FinTech standpoint, and how are they being applied?
Yeah, so sandboxes are interesting. They've kind of become a little, come into vogue in a sense in a lot of places in the world as, financial markets try to understand how we're going to cope with these new technologies that come in with respect to current regulations. Because current regulations were made in the context of kind of a traditional market structure.
Right.
And there's aspects of new technologies, like FinTech, that will come in and change how that happens. And so some creative regulator somewhere, I'm not exactly sure, said, hey, let's have something called a sandbox. So this is not like the toy that you played in when you were little.
Oh, that's what it's named after.
But that's what it's named after. And it's this idea of, hey, let's wall off this space and allow these innovators to play in this space, not subject or constrained by certain regulatory measures. And let's see what happens.
Yeah, give them their toys and let them play and just see what happens.
Yeah, and that'll give us indications of perhaps how we should regulate certain behaviors. But if we put current regulation on them, they may actually not be able to grow.
Yeah.
And it may not be applicable, but we wouldn't know that because they're going to be constrained to begin with. And so if by putting in a regulatory sandbox, that allows us, these kind of new companies that are kind of on the fringe of certain regulatory rules, gives them an opportunity to expand a little bit, and as well as for regulators to observe what happens and how that occurs. But at the same time, the observation thing is important because it's not. They may not be subject to the current rules and regulations, but they, in theory, should be observed, like the effects, the impact that they're having on customers in particular. How is that working? And so. One thing we were discussing in a class we had earlier today, a live class that Dave Bishop and I had today related to FinTech, was the success of regulatory sandboxes in particular jurisdictions like Singapore in Asia. And one of the things we thought was really great was that Singapore, it seems at least, had coordinated a number of different policies in conjunction with their sandbox initiative, even from a few years ago. So I remember hearing about what Singapore was doing a few years ago. In Hong Kong, we've only recently kind of gone down this regulatory sandbox route. And I think we're still trying to coordinate this a little bit more with broader policies and different things that regulators are trying to do. And so I think that's quite an important, we think that's quite an important piece to have if you really want to cultivate innovation. Because if you have people and companies that put out new products, but if they can't test that in a neutral way, not subject to kind of the same regulations that like a fully licensed and staffed brokerage firm or bank would have to subject themselves to, then that can be very onerous on these new innovators. So,
yeah, great question. Thank you. Or great point.
So one of the other awesome comments that we got in the discussion board this week was about privacy. So Celeste Munger, I think it looks like she's from Canada, talked about her thoughts on privacy, and she thought, one of the things that she started off with, that privacy was an illusion.
Privacy is an illusion.
Right.
Period.
And then she ended with an example of DNA testing, which is another large area where a lot of privacy concerns has been raised recently and will continue to be raised, particularly in the biotech space and technologies related to genetics and things like that. So on that note, what do you think about these issues of privacy? I mean, they're super important, but how do we think about them?
So She is probably right to a certain extent. Privacy is an illusion from the standpoint of a fully traditionally private life, because we are constantly, as she pointed out, being recorded. We are ourselves giving out significant information, but at the same time, I'm not sure that's what the definition of privacy means from a rights standpoint. I think if you think of the right to be forgotten, if you think about the right to be able to pull back your information, if you think about the right to be able to do what you want in your own home, which really is fundamental to many other rights in terms of human sexuality and having children. There's just so many aspects of that. It doesn't mean just because we don't have as much privacy in our lives as we go out in the public doesn't mean that it's necessarily eroded privacy as a right. And so I think this is the part that we as society have to do maybe a better job of really thinking through. As Peter-NYC pointed out in a previous module in one of his comments, the concept of privacy, especially privacy as a right, is in and of itself a relatively recent legal construct. It only started happening a little over a century ago. And even up until the 1970s. In
the United States.
Well, correct.
And then globally later, but
later.
But I think we're talking about a U.S. legal context.
In the U.S. legal context, it really started, 150 or so years ago, but really wasn't institutionalized or even codified until the 1970s, actually, when some U.S. Supreme Court cases, including the famous Roe versus Wade, which dealt with abortion rights, where they said there's an implied right to privacy in the U.S. Constitution, and so within the United States and other primarily Western democracies, there was this codified right to privacy. And so in that context, in those nations where that right still exists, I think we do still have a very strong right to privacy, although that does seem to perhaps maybe being eroded slightly. So I think there's a distinction between the legal right to privacy versus how much information about us is kind of flowing out on a daily basis. And so it's complicated, but it's important to be able to parse those things, because as regulation comes in, we want, I think, I should maybe speak for myself, I want more regulation on dealing with my private information. But that's more.
That might not be a technical right to privacy.
Exactly.
Rather,
right? That's like personal information that I want to make sure is being used responsibly and that I understand what's happening with it. But it's separate from my right, my overarching constitutional right to privacy, which means when I'm in my own home, I can do what I want to do. That type of thing.
And I think that's an important point. Like that the potentially the link between traditional forms of right to privacy, which I think initially were like in your home, like people shouldn't be able to just come in and see what you're doing.
Right.
And that link to like people shouldn't just be able to come in and look on your phone.
Yeah.
Perhaps there is a link there, but I don't think that link is traditional in a sense, right? And maybe that will evolve over time. But we tend to use the vocabulary like a right to privacy in various forms. And I think to your point, that has evolved over the last century or so in like what form that takes. So, early on it was about like what you're doing in your house. And but even then certain activities, physical activities, right, sexual activities, weren't necessarily protected for many centuries and decades in America. And that changed, right? And then, when we get to women's rights, that idea of like what I do with my body, is that a right to privacy? What right does that fall under?
Yeah.
Because in a lot of situations, these are not explicitly stated, so they're inferred rights. And so that, again, this will, I think, continue to evolve given how technology is evolving.
Yeah, and I do think, it's interesting because although DNA is not a, kind of FinTech technology, it is a very interesting example that she's provided. For those that are not familiar, just to give you an example of a case that happened in the US within the last few years, there was a gentleman in California who did one of these kind of private DNA testing services. You scrub the inside of your mouth, you put it into a vial, you send it in, and then they provide you DNA information about yourself. And maybe what he didn't realize at the time was that as part of the user terms of service, you also agree for that DNA information to be uploaded on a public website, which then becomes kind of, I guess, I don't know all the details, but public domain or something.
Yeah, usually, because I actually did get my DNA tested on one of the commercial providers, I don't know, a few years ago. And it serves a lot of different purposes. It's forefathers came from. You can see there's health indicators that could be helpful. I mean, and there's some questionability about how accurate they are, but like it gives you a general sense. But yeah, one of the things I remember as I was doing research was they take you through a series of kind of terms and conditions, and they basically say, will you allow your data to be included in certain databases that will be used and tested and whatnot? And I always opted out of those because I was kind of aware of those issues. Because you don't, basically the fundamental question is, where will that end up eventually? And you actually don't know that. It's not clear to you. And until that was clear to me, I didn't want to participate. And so I opted out as much as I could. And I think to your point, this person didn't do that.
Which ended up. Do you know what happens?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead and finish. Yeah, go ahead.
So the FBI apparently was looking for I don't know if it's the FBI, but police authorities were looking for someone who apparently had killed a number of people.
Serial killer, yeah.
Yep. And they had some DNA evidence, and through kind of basically linking of genealogy, so genetics of related like family trees, they were able to figure out, this person was probably related to this person, and eventually figured out it was this particular individual who had actually provided his own evidence himself that ended up leading to his arrest.
Yeah, so it's really kind of amazing and yet scary at the same time. So a lot of people that read this story were like, wow, this is so cool.
Yeah, like CSI, TV show.
CSI. I mean, these cases had gone cold, and I think in the 1980s, so it had been 30 or more years. The idea is the killer's long gone, there's no way you're going to find them, and then boom, you've got him. But then it's like, oh, wait a minute. This guy sent in his vial of DNA. He was not expecting this to be run through a criminal database. And so again, there's a good outcome. You found a serial killer, but I think it caused a lot of people to think, now wait a minute, what's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years into the future? What if they want to, because of ideology or race?
And this becomes one of these really kind of dual-edged swords, because I think probably when we were in law school, a number of law schools in the United States got involved in Project Innocence. Where they were just basically trying to represent people who they felt were falsely imprisoned. And one of the ways that they were able to help a lot of these people that were incarcerated, usually minorities, socioeconomically very kind of disadvantaged, was through the advances in DNA technology, which showed, actually this evidence that you have is not this person. And then they were able to free a number of people. And so, again, it's like this, of course, you don't want people to be incarcerated wrongly, but at the same time, you can see a lot of different situations where a proliferation of this kind of data, where it becomes commercialized or commoditized, and then it ends up in the hands of, actors who are using it, maybe not for nefarious purposes, but at least for profit, then it ends up becoming a problem. So you could easily think of people that need insurance. You had an insurance company getting genetic markers, and even if you're not sick, they say, well, you've got an X% chance that you're going to get sick with this disease, so we're not going to insure you, right? And so these are not the type of necessary, I don't think, the outcomes that we want, or at the very least, these are the type of things we want to think about before just wholesale, let's open this up.
Yeah, so again, like many things in the course, dual-edged sword. There's a lot of benefits that can come from this, probably some unintended negative consequences, and so we need to be very thoughtful about these things as we roll them out.
Our heartfelt thanks again for your participation and contributions. Putting this course together definitely was not easy, a labor of love with the emphasis on labor, but your enthusiastic engagement has really made the effort worth it.
Now, in some ways, the next module is really our favorite. In Module 4, we will explore artificial intelligence and its implications, which is and will only become more relevant in the future. And we're sure that many of you are already thinking about artificial intelligence in some way. And we hope the content is interesting and really look forward to your thoughts and reactions. So we'll see you next week.